point. Once again, welcome to the latest Getting Hybrid Work Right call series episode. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and I'd like to welcome everyone for joining today. For those of you that are new to this call series and perhaps new to I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're largely a research firm in the human resources, human capital space. We discover the people practices that drive high performance. What we mean by high performance are organizations that excel in 4 areas: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. So for all of our studies, all of our surveys, when we're asking questions, whether it's on talent acquisition, DE&I, learning and development, whatever the area might be, we like to compare the high-performing organizations according to those 4 criteria with the low-performing organizations. That gives us a sense for what are the best practices that are being done more often, and then even more so what we like to call the next practices, those practices that few organizations are doing, but that have a strong correlation to performance. We are a member-driven organization, so we'd like to always welcome and thank all of our member organizations. This is just a small snapshot, just a fraction of the members of I4CP. If you don't see your logo up here, if you don't think your organization is a member, feel free to reach out to me or to just go to the website and use the contact information there. We'd be happy to talk to you about what membership entails. As I said, this is an ongoing series, so if this is your first time joining us, welcome. We have our meetings on the topic of hybrid work every other Thursday. So we're meeting today, we'll be meeting again on the 26th and again on June 9th, as you see there on the right. Got some great guests for those calls: Anna White, CHRO at F5 Networks, Richard Stone, VP of HR Global Functions at Mondelez. They'll be joining us as guests on those calls. Interspersed between the Getting Hybrid Work Right calls is our Next Practices monthly series. And this is where we cycle through the different main functional areas of HR. You see talent and learning will be next week, where we've got Margaret Klein, Dean of Leadership and Ethics at the U.S. Naval War College, will be joining us. And then Beck Bailey from Accenture will be joining us to talk about DE&I issues. We cycle through talent acquisition, HR strategy, lots of different areas on those alternating Thursdays. Always, though, at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. For today, you've just got me as your host. Typically, I'm joined by our CEO and co-founder, Kevin Oakes. But today, it's just me, and we also don't have a guest. So what we're going to be doing here in just a moment is running through the sort of list of topics that you see there on the left. I've got some data, some things I want to share with you on each, but I really want this to be an open discussion, a collaborative conversation, if you will. So keep the chat open, and also locate, if you could, the raise hand button. I believe that's usually on the reactions button on your Zoom control area. If you want to come off mute at some point and verbalize a question or make a comment that way instead of just using the chat, feel free to do that. But with well over 100 folks on the call today, if you could use the raise hand icon, that would be helpful to alert me to your desire to do that, and also to keep things somewhat orderly. Want to note a couple of things. As I said, we're a human capital research firm. A lot of what we produce is reserved only for our members. However, oftentimes we'll make executive briefs and certain infographics or articles available to the broader public. Our latest study is called The Talent Imperative. We did this in conjunction with Fortune magazine in partnership with them. We've got early findings that we have made available in a brief, and this is available out at our website. You see the URL there, and thank you to my colleague Zeta for putting that in the chat for everyone. So you can download this and take a look at some of the preliminary findings. There will be a full report from this study that will be available only to members, and I believe that's due to come out in just a matter of weeks. So members on the call, you should be looking forward to that for sure. Also want to note something for our members. So any members on the call, if you haven't already downloaded our Workplace Flexibility Readiness Audit, this is a great guide that my colleague Carrie Naiman created. Like me, she's a senior research analyst here on the research team at I4CP. You see here the range of things that the sort of the table of contents there on the right, what is included in this workplace flexibility sort of audit guide. And again, this is available for I4CP members. For those of you on the call who are members, if you haven't downloaded this, the link is there in the chat as well. So as the agenda slide indicated, since we don't have a guest today, we just have me as a host, I wanted to do a somewhat rapid fire coverage of a lot of different topics. So hopefully, even if not all of them are of great pertinence to you, at least some of them will be, and we'll cover a lot of ground this way. And I had this idea of calling it the potpourri of hybrid work. If you're familiar with dried flowers and things like that, that's the real use of the word potpourri. But I'm not the first to use it to also just mean sort of a hodgepodge of topics. Any Jeopardy fans out there might remember back in the Alex Trebek days, whenever they had sort of a catch-all topic, they would call that the potpourri topic. So that's where I'm getting my guidance for today's session. So I wanted to start off by sharing a little bit on the latest US jobs data, and then have a discussion around the current labor market and hear from you all how it's all going. So the latest, main numbers coming out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, was somewhat positive. 428,000 jobs added in the US. That was slightly above market expectations. The headline unemployment rate held steady at 3.6, which is also historically quite good, just above the record low that we saw in 2019. That said, there was some negative, as there always is a mix in this kind of data. The labor force participation rate dropped to 62.2%. That had been slowly decreasing for lots of different reasons, demographics and economic reasons and so on, over sort of 20 years prior to the pandemic. It then sort of plunged rapidly, of course, during the pandemic, and it's been slowly creeping back up, but it seems to have sort of stalled out now. But the other data that is usually less well known by folks, and I'm assuming less well known by many of you on the call, is what's called JOLTS. I'm not sure if everyone even knew what that stood for, but the JOLTS data is job openings and labor turnover. And of course, with the Great Resignation, with all the headlines and all the pain in the labor market for a lot of employers, this is in some ways the more interesting data. How many people are quitting? How many open jobs are there? How much hiring is actually going on? So I wanted to quickly review some of this data with you. In March, there was a new record set for job openings, again, in the United States, over 11.5 million. That surpassed the December total. Of course, if the United States population is growing, if the economy is growing, then there would be more and more job openings. So what's even more interesting than that 11.5 million figure is the rate. And that's what the graph there on the right is, the rate of job openings. And that means the total number of openings divided by sort of openings and total jobs. So it's sort of, think of it as sort of the percentage of openings relative to the size of the economy. And you can see here, if you go over to the far right, there's that dip in 2020 from the recession, or rather from the pandemic. And then it relatively quickly went back up again, and it's just been on rocket fuel ever since, that nearly vertical line there from 2021, 2022. So both the total number of job openings and the rate are at record highs. There's a fair amount of hiring going on, so it's not like we have all these openings and no hiring is happening. You see here the graph, again on the far right, there was that massive drop off in hiring when the pandemic first hit. Then we quickly surged back up again. This is the hiring rate, and then it's dropped down to more or less trend line. You see it had been growing for a while since, say, 2012, and it's been growing again since we got over the early days of the pandemic. So certainly a fair amount of hiring going on in the US economy. And then lastly, I wanted to share with you the quit rate. This is what's been causing the most angst and the most consternation for a lot of folks. March, we saw a record 4.5 million people quitting their jobs in the United States. This sort of the quit rate itself, so again, sort of divided by the size of the economy, also tied a record from November and December of last year. Quits were, of course, sort of artificially low for a while. People were afraid to quit their jobs if they weren't forced to during the early days of the pandemic. And so some of this massive quitting that's going on, this great resignation, is in some ways sort of a rebound from the artificially low quits during 2020. But at this point, I've analyzed this data. Other people, professional economists have looked at this, and we're sort of beyond that. We got through a lot of that in 2021, sort of making up for the lull in quits in 2020. And the quits just keep coming. And I'm sure many of you on the call are feeling this. Maybe you're experiencing it personally yourself if you've recently transitioned jobs, but your organizations are probably feeling it as well. And so with all that data, happy to entertain any questions or comments on that data. That data is publicly available from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Thanks again, Zeta, for putting the link in the chat for anyone that likes digging into data like that and seeing that, you read the headlines in the paper or online, but to be able to dive in and grab the charts yourself can be helpful. So I want to open it up to discussion either about any of that data, what you're seeing in the market, or also what you see here. This is from one of our recent studies where we asked, sort of given the competitive talent market that we're all in, what elements of your employee value prop are most important for your organization to offer in the coming year? And you see the runaway winner there, 49%, is what we're all gathered here to talk about today: flexibility and work arrangements. So hybrid work and other forms of flexibility, by far the #1 aspect of EVP that folks are focusing on. You see some of the other interesting ones here: commitment to diversity and inclusion and belonging, purpose, mission of the organization, and then quite a range of other things, including compensation at 1 out of 4 organizations indicating that in their top 3. So let me pause here. I've been talking a lot, shared a lot of data with you. I'd like to hear from some of you all. Again, feel free to use the chat or raise your hand. How's it going at your organization in terms of this crazy job market? What are you doing in terms of employee value prop? What are you doing to encourage both retention and hiring at your organizations? Feel free to talk about any of the things you see there on the screen, any of those elements of EVP. Love to hear from just a few of you. Anything interesting that you've done recently? Shayna shared in the chat, creating more robust career pathing. Yeah, absolutely. So L&D opportunities, we see that here on the chart at 26%. So you're certainly not alone, Shayna, in focusing on that at your organization. I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Feel free to just unmute yourself and chime in. Clara noting a lot of focus on employee well-being.
Tom?
Yes.
Hi, it's Marcia from Research Financial. Actually, what we're trying to do is step back and package all the things that we've actually been doing over the last 6 months so that we can make sure that people understand the full understanding of what we're offering and not just kind of speaking to pieces and parts of what we've been doing, because we have found, certainly in Canada, the big banks have come out with some pretty strong statements around compensation in particular, that they've given particular levels in their organization. RBC, for example, also came out with a broader package than that actually is an offering for all their employees. So they're making very strong statements to their employees as to what they're offering and what that looks like. And so we're smaller, way smaller than they are, but we've done a number of things as well, including things for wellness. We actually are looking at what we need to do with our employee value proposition in particular, but we've done a number of really cool things around benefits and what we're trying to do with career. So we are packaging what we have been doing so that we can actually start to articulate that both internally and externally. So we're in the process of that, but we are very, very clear that we must get out there with our information so that people understand that we are in the mix of all the bigger organizations as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the banks. Obviously, they can be a competitive nightmare for a lot of folks in other industries, as can the tech industry. Basically, any industry that has a lot of cash sitting on hand. Financials and tech often are those. And it looks like you're not the only one that's taking that I think wise approach of trying to package and message together all of the different things you're doing, maybe hitting on many of the things that are in this bar chart here. I see Tanya Piazza Hughes in the chat doing the same thing. She says they're emphasizing the total compensation, benefits, flexibility, time off, all of these aspects of the employee value prop has become a top value for their recruiting efforts. Sort of reminds me of maybe several years ago when a lot of organizations started or re-emphasized their total rewards packaging. I remember working at a few companies and getting these briefs with, these are all the things we do beyond your salary that are part of your total rewards package. So I think that quickly became sort of standard at a lot of companies, but today, including things like flexibility, the inclusion aspects of the company, aren't you glad you work for a company with such a great social mission, all of these messaging things that are part of the broader EVP. I think that's a really wise approach. I see a couple people in the chat also talking about onboarding, something that they've been revamping or taking a fresh look at. A lot of companies, of course, had to shift, at least for some of their employees, to virtual onboarding. And maybe it's been a year or two now into that, and time to take another look at it and see how can they up that, or how if they're going back to onboarding on site for a lot of employees, even those that don't have to be on site, how can they really make that a compelling experience? Anyone else want to share what they're doing around EVP during these difficult labor market times? Either of the folks that had talked about onboarding in the chat, do you want to come off mute and say a little bit specific about what you've done there?
Hi, this is Clara. What we've done is, instead of thinking about onboarding as a one-time event where you bring new employees in for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days kind of onboarding or orientation, we're thinking about it from an experience standpoint, all the way from recruiting to hiring to joining, and then the onboarding experience through their first year of employment, and that it's not just an HR activity. It's about helping them integrate into all aspects of the organization, and then also inviting their leaders to be a part of that. We have what's called a culture champion network. So we're looking at connecting new employees with existing employees. So it's really about a full, little over a year worth experience from an onboarding standpoint.
I love that. I love that. It's a subtle distinction, but instead of it being a process, maybe making it more of an experience. Sometimes little things like that can make all the difference in it being a truly valuable experience for the new hires, the new joiners. At I4CP, those of you that are members, we do have a pretty robust onboarding toolkit that we have. We created it prior to the pandemic, but then we updated it during the pandemic to take into account all the various changes that have occurred in the past couple of years. So again, members on the call, if you've never seen our onboarding toolkit, it's pretty robust. So I'd encourage you to check that out. Lastly here, before we move on to a sort of another topic here, I'd love to get some people to chime in with maybe answers or thoughts on Crystal's question from the chat. She says, we are a large healthcare organization. She's wondering how others are applying flexibility of some sort to team members who, due to the nature of their job, have to be on site. So whether these are frontline workers, or they could be salaried, of course, workers, but due to the nature of their job, they have to be on site. And so there is no flexibility around remote, but there might be still flexibility around time of day or shifts or days of week, or maybe other aspects of work life. Anyone having any success with introducing or even experimenting with flexibility for on-site workers? It's definitely trickier than just being able to say you can work from home. Crystal, I see you on camera. Is there anything that you guys are considering trying, or anything more specific you want to give voice to?
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button.
All right.
Yes, there are things that we are talking about, nothing concrete, but there's conversations around more flexibility in hours in determining your schedule, and maybe even having people grouped into cohorts or teams where they do more managing of how they are represented on site, whether it be maybe some can work on site and do activities on site, and some of the job can be done remote, and they can switch. We're still very much in the early stages and just brainstorming ideas. But the challenge for us is about 70% of our workforce is on site. And while 30% are currently virtual, we don't want to create disparity where people feel like there's a haves and have-nots, and maybe there's some advantage given that flexibility in work arrangements is so high. And we know once you start offering it to some, others will want to see, what's in it for them. So we're trying to figure out, for instead of just being about 30% of our workforce, let this be about 100% of our workforce. But we really know that the where is going to be dictated by the job in areas where we don't have options.
Right. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I love the comment from Clara there in the chat, and a few others that have been coming through in the chat too, around the word flexibility needs to not just be equated with location or the where. It needs to be much broader than that. That's certainly the tack we've taken at I4CP in several of our recent studies, and also that guide that I mentioned earlier for members, the flexibility guide. That spans not just location flexibility, remote, on-site, hybrid, but also flexibility of time of day, days of week, and other aspects as well. Even things like time off and whatnot. So one thing I'll mention that we've heard from in talking to some organizations lately, particularly in the retail space, but I think it would apply to a lot of organizations that have on-site workers, is creating or adding to a mobile app for your organization that allows people to schedule and reschedule themselves. That gives people some autonomy. It allows them to connect with their coworkers that maybe have complementary scheduling needs. And it makes life easier for the manager as well. Perhaps the workflow still includes some sort of manager approval step in there, but taking that off the plate of the more archaic process of having to call or text or email a manager and ask for permission, and then the manager having to find the replacement, giving more of that power directly to the frontline employees is something that we've seen a lot of some very large retail organizations starting to do.
Tom, this is Ann Losby. I would just add to the conversation that we're doing the same thing. We're trying to be really generous around flexibility. And the problem is it's almost too much, because what do you do when it's almost unlimited? And so one of the things that I think we're experimenting with is engaging the populations that perceive they have the least flexibility, the customer service reps, the folks that are on the line, who perceive like, well, that's for the others. We don't really get that. Well, is that true? Like to the points many have made in the chat, how do we define flexibility? One size does not fit all, and giving people, and involving them in defining, what does flexibility mean to you? What would you like? How could we make this work? Versus just managers and leaders trying to figure it out.
Yeah, those are great points, Ann. And I think we also just want to emphasize, while flexibility was the #1 response here in terms of what organizations are doing for the employee value proposition, it's not the only. In fact, if you add up all the others, they certainly a lot more going on here than just flexibility. Even on something like compensation, there was a trend that was, predates the pandemic, of offering same-day pay for hourly workers. And that can really help in terms of the flexibility of someone's life. Being able to get paid on a daily basis instead of weekly or biweekly can almost feel like a flexibility gain, because it allows them to access what they've earned much more quickly. So there's a lot you can do here on a lot of these elements of the EVP, even beyond just the flexibility piece. All right, let's move on. I wanted to share a couple of interesting news items that came out recently. This one was very recent, just a couple days ago. Fortune ran an article with the headline, "Job vacancies for Salesforce.com are now listed by time zone," reveals the CEO. We'll put the link to that article in the chat if you want to read more about it, but that's the main takeaway from it that was sort of new. A lot of the other things Salesforce is doing, we've seen from other companies in terms of having a relatively open hybrid and remote workforce at this point. That is their go forward plan. Of course, being a technology company allows for that for the vast majority of their employees. But in terms of hiring, in terms of their actual job descriptions, I did pick up on this, that it was interesting. They're no longer saying New York City or San Francisco. They're just saying time zone to attract a broader audience of applicants. And then Airbnb released a press release recently that I thought was worth walking through. There was 5 key points in their hybrid work plan. So for them, again, a technology company, they're saying you can work from home or the office, whatever works best for you. You can also move anywhere in the country, like from San Francisco to Nashville. And in their case, they're saying your compensation won't change. This is, of course, a very touchy subject. Different companies taking different tacks with that. This is a bit more rare. You have the flexibility to live and work in 170 countries for up to 90 days a year in each location. So that's an interesting approach that we don't see too often. We'll meet up regularly for team gatherings, so they will still emphasize in-person gatherings. Most employees will connect in person every quarter, so not just once a year, but several times a year for about a week at a time, some more even frequently than that. And to pull this off, I found this interesting. They're going to operate off a multi-year roadmap with 2 major product releases. Again, they're a software company primarily, which will keep them working, they say, in a highly coordinated way. So a couple of interesting things here. Bullet number 3 is interesting. Don't see that a lot in terms of suggesting folks could live in other areas of the country or other areas of the world. And then it's actually shifting their product cycle, their new hybrid approach to work and largely remote approach to work, actually impacting their product roadmap and their approach to product releases. So I found that interesting. While at the same time, bullet number 4 here, still seeing the value of getting together in person. And the link for this article, which again, we've put in the chat for you, is something that goes into more detail on just how much they do value the in-person gatherings. So I want to pause here and get some reflections from you all. Of course, these are 2 companies that greatly benefit from the expansion of hybrid and remote work. If you think about it, Salesforce.com owns Slack, right? They purchased the Slack platform, which is very much like Microsoft Teams. And so they sort of benefit from folks using that software. And then Airbnb, of course, particularly that 3rd bullet, they would love you to move around the world and work from different locations, because you're probably going to leverage Airbnb or a similar service to make that happen. So yes, some self-interest on the part of these 2 companies to make public their stances and their approaches here. Nonetheless, some interesting elements. Any thoughts on either of these? The shift to using time zones instead of locations in job descriptions, or any of the elements that you're seeing here from Airbnb? Anyone else on the call doing some of the more unique things that Airbnb, or even considering doing some of the things Airbnb is offering? Yeah, I agree, Louis. It is a great talent attraction strategy. And Tanya says, love the time zones. Tax law is definitely an issue that arises when you're working across all the different locations. I think a lot of companies are finding that is an issue, but it's not insurmountable, obviously. Dave is noting in the chat that they're also doing the move anywhere in the country and that the compensation won't change. Parenthetically, he adds, at least for now.
I'm guessing the 90 days thing is to get around the tax implications.
Yes, very likely. I think a lot of places certainly have a less than half the year tax implication, but in some places it might be even more strict than that. So Eric, I think you're right on that. And yeah, Sujatha is noting about time zones and the importance of that in terms of collaboration, in terms of being able to work together on things. You know, it's interesting that Salesforce is still taking that into consideration. Certainly, we all live in a global world now, and we work from people from around the world all the time. But it's not perfect; it's not always clean. And the more you can have people in the same 1 or 2 or even 3 time zones that are adjacent, certainly does help with that. All right, let's move on then to, I want to talk a little bit, a lot of that is sort of the positives for some of these companies, for at least Salesforce and Airbnb, and probably for many of the others on the call today. But I'd like to do a little discussion now of some of the tensions that might be arising with hybrid work. This was a recent report we came out with called Flexibility or Flight. You see here just the high level, the 4 key findings: that high performance hybrid requires flexibility, not rigidity. We've seen that in some of the headlines recently about Apple requiring that you be in certain 3 days a week as opposed to full flexibility. Second key finding here: on-site workers need flexibility too. So we've already touched on that both in the chat and our earlier discussion. Success with truly flexible work requires planning and targeted effort. And then lastly, because the CEO said so is not a sound reason to return to the office. So those are the 4 key findings from this study. Again, this is available to I4CP members. There's a lot more on all 4 of these. What I'd like to do now, though, is talk a little bit about some of those findings and some of these tensions that might be arising. That first one here, rigidity versus true flexibility, some of the differences between senior leaders and what employees are wanting, so CEO and otherwise. So thanks, Zeta, for bringing up the poll. Which of the following describe tensions that you are seeing arise around flexible or hybrid work at your organization? I think we've all heard of these tensions arising from newspaper and online headlines, but at your organization, choose as many here as you want. Which of these have you seen arising so far? It's still early days with hybrid work, of course, but let us know which of these you're seeing. And the votes are coming in. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Still coming in, so we'll give it another few minutes. And then if you've got a comment you'd like to make about any of these tensions, I would love to hear it either in the chat or, again, come off mute if you'd like to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And we see the number 1 tension was the one mentioned on the previous slide as one of our key findings, the issue of rigid hybrid models, like say a set 3 days in the office, 2 days in the office, or 4x1 or whatever, versus true flexibility. That was the number 1 tension that folks are seeing here. Employees and managers versus senior leaders. Again, a key finding from our study. Senior leaders, CEO or otherwise, maybe wanting one thing, employees and managers wanting something else. A bit less of a tension between employees and their managers. We have heard this from some organizations where some managers are just having a lot of difficulty with the level of flexibility that's being offered or with other elements of hybrid work. Maybe some of them didn't up their game as well in the past couple of years with managing a virtual team, and now suddenly they're finding this isn't going away, this is permanent, and they need to improve in that area. And then what we discussed before, the flexibility differences and overall employee value prop differences between knowledge workers, so-called laptop workers, versus those that are on site. So I'd love to hear some folks, if you want to add a little more color to some of these tensions, what have been the biggest tensions for you? What have you done maybe to overcome them? What have you tried, experimented with? Who can we hear from?
So we have, it's interesting because we have the overwhelming support of our executive population, which has been a pleasant surprise. We had anticipated, given during the first days of the pandemic, when we moved to virtual, it was our executives who were the most resistant, apprehensive, and they have made a complete 180 and are extremely committed and supported. But we're finding that our managers and supervisors are not as enthusiastic, and we have some data, but for the most part, just anecdotal feedback that they haven't been socialized to the messages as often as our executive population. The information has not trickled down, and we are finding that the employees know very little about our organizational stance around flexibility. I think what's interesting is we evolved to flexibility based upon our sentiment survey, where employees said, our team members actually said that we love working virtually, we love working remote, but we do want to be in the office. We want to have that flexibility. I don't know if it was largely due to, because we took the survey in 2021, when people, 2020 and 2021, where people were largely isolated because we had to be. Right. And they were maybe they're craving that social interaction. So I don't know if that's why they were saying that we do our survey again in June of this year. But at the time, I think that did influence their findings. But we have evolved to flexibility because our team members are saying, hey, I do like being virtual. I don't want you to take that away, but I also want to be back in the office. But I want to have autonomy to figure out when is best to be in the office. And if I'm called in the office, I want it to be intentional, to have purpose, and not me just sitting at a desk attending meetings virtually.
Yeah, so that's great. It sounds like you're fortunate that you're not suffering the third one here about employees and managers versus senior leaders. So that is great to hear for your organization. But it's great also that you used your sentiment analysis, listen to employees to come up with your approach, and that they're voicing what that first tension would otherwise be saying, that they want true flexibility, not a more rigid approach. Kelly, I see your hand up. I would love to hear from you.
Sure. So this is a tension that I personally am experiencing. I'm curious, I don't know how widespread it is in my organization or if others have this, but we're basically operating on a true flexibility model right now. And so people have a choice to come into the office or not. And for me personally, I would like to be in the office more. I would like to see people. But when I go to the office, it's pretty empty. And so then I feel like just alone in the office. And it doesn't feel that much different than working at home. But I think there's like got to be some level of like critical mass that has to accumulate in order for me to feel like, oh, it would be worth it because there's going to be, 15 other people there and I could see them, or the person that I actually enjoy being around, like a particular friend or somebody who I have a relationship with instead of just a, couple random other people. So I think we're kind of struggling with like how to get people into the office without, we are planning on doing some of these more like team activities and things like that, that people will be like required to come to, but sort of, I don't know if others are experiencing that same, it's sort of kind of like an internal tension for me personally, but I'm wondering like how much it is for other people and organizations.
Yeah, while you were speaking to that point, Tanya, Elizabeth, both saying the same thing. Elizabeth even calling it sort of a catch-22, that people want to be able to come back and have that flexibility, but then the value's not really there if you're the only one that comes in. I flipped back to this Airbnb slide because that I think is a big driving reason. behind them doing at least quarterly, if not more often, gatherings on site, whether it's the whole company or just team gatherings, as they emphasize here in bullet point number 4. I think they're being very intentional by the sounds of it, very purposeful in bringing people back on site for those days or even weeks at a time. And that probably for those folks will fulfill that need, that desire to be social in person in that way. It doesn't have to be something quarterly. It doesn't have to be something like a big event, though. I think managers, if they have the flexibility, they could say, hey, we're doing this next Friday. You know, we're going to come in for those of you that are within driving distance, and here's why. That's the key thing. People need to understand the why, the purpose, the intentionality behind it. We're going to do this work best on this Friday by coming together in this way. We've talked with lots of companies where that's the sort of principle that they're giving their managers. They have the flexibility, but they're encouraging them to look at the business, look at the productivity and the work that needs to be done, but also look at what your employees are saying and how much they would benefit from being together on a periodic basis. And it doesn't have to be, again, rigidly scheduled. It doesn't have to be like the first Wednesday of every month, although you could do that. So lots of different possibilities that I think we're all just sort of learning and experimenting with together at this point. And I see some folks in the chat chiming in with what they're doing. Danielle, our team has bi-weekly 1-hour meetings. Encourage everyone to come in those 2 days each month. That's exactly the kind of thing. So thanks for that, Danielle. Exactly the kind of thing I was just describing. Sonia, I see you've got your hand up as well.
Sorry about that. Took a second. So one of the things that's come up, and I'm wondering if people have dealt with this or how they've dealt with it, is when thinking of diversity and inclusion, we do have people who are immunocompromised or have other health conditions, which make it more risky for them to come into the office. And the policies that have been going out with the masking requirements make people very uncomfortable to come into the office if they are in one of those positions, let alone the sort of social impacts of why are you wearing a mask and people kind of wondering what's going on. And I just didn't know, from a diversity and inclusion perspective, really thinking about including everyone. And there was a great article, and I forget where it came from, where instead of talking about mask mandates, they're talking about mask protections for people, right? So flipping the ideas of how we kind of communicate those things. But I didn't know, does anyone have any good thoughts or ideas of how we can better include people who may have health conditions that make it more risky to be in person?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was actually a topic that I had on the drawing board for this call today. What are companies currently doing about mask mandates, about vaccine mandates or testing requirements? Because a lot's happened since the early part of the year on all these fronts. And we've seen some companies roll back vaccine requirements and even mask requirements and so on, but other companies haven't yet. So yeah, it's an interesting question. And the angle that you're bringing it up for the protection of those that are immune compromised is certainly an interesting one. Hopefully some folks will chime in here in the chat with that. Feel free, anyone, if you want to come off mute and give voice to that, if you've got a policy or an approach that you've been trying. Again, I feel like that's something that a lot of organizations are going to sort of learn as we go along here on.
I'd like to add, I just saw, Susan, thanks. Yeah, there's, a medical exemption is great, but then you're excluded from what's happening on site, right? So I think this is what we're grappling with, is people want to come. It's not that they don't want to come, but they don't feel safe coming, right? Because whether it's the vaccines, the reporting procedures, the masking, the whatever's going on. So it's just it's been an interesting ride.
Certainly at the very least, you would want to A, allow for masks, and B, allow, sort of create a culture of respect that says that if a person wants to wear a mask for their own protection, that should be encouraged and in no way looked down upon or anything like that. The difficulty is whether or not you're going to require it for everyone else around them.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. While we were talking on that, we flipped ahead to one other topic I wanted to hit on today, which was leadership roles. And we've had a poll open. So if you haven't seen or done the poll yet, please chime in with our poll question here on what are organizations doing to formalize either a role or a group to lead flexible and hybrid work practices and policies. I've got some information here on the screen from Zillow. We've got a new case study that my colleague Carol Morrison led on. It's actually an update from an earlier case study with Zillow. Zillow has been sort of at the leading edge of remote work and virtual work and so on. They're very much a remote first company, as the second bullet here says. Although they are focused on having, as we were just talking about, frequent in-person gatherings. You see that these bullets here on the screen are the responsibilities of a newly appointed senior manager of flexible work, which has a team of 5 dedicated to making all of this work. So Zillow is not the hugest company in the world, and yet they're really putting a lot behind this in terms of a leadership position in a team to make their sort of remote first philosophy fly going forward. So some interesting responsibilities for this person and this team here. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share out the results. So only 12% of you all on the call today indicating that you've created such a new leadership position. Another one person said considering it. 28% saying that you have or soon will have a council or committee that basically would have a lot of these responsibilities just spread out amongst several individuals. And then 34% saying you're not planning to do this, at least not at this time. So any thoughts here? And any of the folks that have created this position, I'm curious, who does it report into? What level is it at? Manager, director, or higher? Or those of you that have a council or committee, who is on that council or committee? Who is it drawing from? What parts of the organization? Sharon.
So actually, I'm new in role, started in March. Culture transformation and future work is my role, and I lead a cross-functional team that represents all the divisions across the organization. And so that team works together to do the future work modeling design, and I report into the CHRO and accountable to the entire ELT.
Very good. Team. Well, very good, and congratulations on the new role. I see Kelly in the chat saying that they've created the position within HR department. Reports to the HR director, but they're still recruiting for it, so haven't filled it yet. Anyone on the call that might be interested in such a role, give Kelly a call. Anyone else that has either created a position or is planning to? You see here some of the responsibilities. These might help you flesh out what that job description might look like. Or if you've got a council or committee, again, I'd be interested what parts of the organization, presumably at least some representation from HR, but it might also have ops, might also have IT, might also have real estate. Alyssa.
Yeah, we have a newly created team, 3 of us reporting into our talent area, actually. So part of our employee experience unit. We haven't named it yet, but will be something around hybrid work experience and flexible work. It's at the senior manager level.
Senior manager, yeah, thank you for that added detail. I've actually done some searches recently for sort of new type of positions at organizations, and certainly hybrid director, hybrid work manager, future of work, lots of new positions at a lot of different companies, and for all of those things, as are some other things. Talent mobility is another area that there's some organizations that are now recruiting for new leaders in those areas. Hey, Kelly, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well.
So we don't have a position necessarily, but last summer, I guess, we formed a committee of senior leaders from around the company to really establish what our new working model guideline or principles would be. And, we are now a remote organization with on-site capabilities, and we've expanded that we call it Workforce 2022 and beyond, But we've expanded that committee now to include, we've moved into implementation phase where we have, our chief risk officer, our human resource officer, myself from an OD perspective. We have IT representatives, we have facility representatives really trying to work collaboratively on all the different elements to fulfill these principles in our physical structure as well as in our behavioral structure.
Got it. Very good. Thank you. And thanks everyone else who's been sharing over in the chat, Valerie and Marnie and Dave and Deborah. Great ads here in the chat around whether it's a council, a committee. Appreciate those examples or the new roles that some folks have. All right, we've got about 8-9 minutes left here on the call. I want to go to one more topic at least, hybrid work success measurement. It's still early days, so that's the caveat here, of course. But what are some metrics that you all are looking at around whether or not you will know that your approach to hybrid work, your approach to flexible work practices are successful? I've listed some possibilities here in the bullet list. What are some yellow or red flags that you'd be looking for? And do you have a timeline or a time scale that you're going to be taking these measurements at later this year into 2023? Anyone already doing it and maybe already making some tweaks to their plans? What are the thoughts here around success measurement? Alyssa, please.
For us, we have started to record people's work mode. So we don't have a mandatory days that people need to work in person. People can choose whether they're working virtually or in hybrid or in office work mode. And so one of the filters that we'll use to look at employee engagement survey data along with promotion trends and career development will be that filter of work mode to make sure that there's not inequities across those.
Good, very good. And I like, Kelly, what you added in the chat too. It's a little more narrow than what I was even thinking of, but that's great that you're doing surveys of hybrid meetings to gauge the experience across the virtual attendees versus the in-person attendees. Hybrid meeting issues is certainly, we've covered a lot on previous calls. They're a real challenge. And so I think it's a good idea to do surveys specific to those kind of meetings. Anyone else? Katrina.
Hi there. I also just wanted to add that I think it might be a good idea to try to create some metrics that are showing if we're starting to slip back into some pre-pandemic behaviors, especially because I think organizations as a whole, I think some of the things we're hearing is that some of our senior leadership would desire back to the 5-day a week, seeing all of our friends every day. And so what are those triggers that would kind of be a no-go that we could kind of pull back and say we need to, figure something out because people are starting to come in 3 or 4 days a week. And really that's not really what we're looking for before we do things like our engagement surveys and start to see people being very unhappy.
Right, yeah, so maybe doing some pulses on employees that ask very pointed questions like, are you feeling pressured to come into the office more often than our flexibility principles permit? Or are you sensing on the issue of proximity bias, promotions and opportunities and things like that going to those that maybe are more often seen in and around the office? Are you experiencing that yet? Again, early days, so I'd be surprised if too many people are, but that certainly is a fear we've heard a lot about because it's something that was often given as a reason to not have remote work and not have virtual work in the past. Leadership always trotted that out as, in my view, sort of as an excuse. So if you work from home, you won't be eligible for promotions. We've actually had a few CEOs state that in the press. as like that will be the position explicitly, which is rather amazing. But yeah, doing some pulses with very targeted questions like that, like you say, Katrina, before you start seeing the negative results in the actual engagement numbers.
Yeah, well, and trying organizationally to find what other metrics can be put in place that are hard data instead of feelings, right?
Right.
So we can show, because generally speaking, feelings don't move mountains, but hard data, hard facts do. And so if we start to show trends, so what is it that we can look at that in our own organizations that will help us say, originally we had 25% coming in the office per week. Now we're looking at 40%. What is causing the increase? What are we, is this okay?
Yeah, maybe it's fine. Maybe it's a positive.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I love some of the other things that are coming through here in the chat. Appreciate this added conversation. We're just about at the end of our hour. I had one more topic, but I think I'm going to hold it for a future call. So at this point, I just want to thank everyone for all of your contributions. If you didn't realize this from past calls, all of these Thursday calls are recorded and are posted in an archive. So if you've missed some previous calls, you should really look back and see some of the special guests we've had, whether it's the Getting Hybrid Work Right series or the alternating weeks with our Next Practice monthly calls. We've had a lot of great CHROs and chief learning officers and chief diversity officers. A lot of great guests over the past couple of years since we've been doing these publicly available free calls. So I'd encourage you to check out the archive. We often post pretty detailed notes as well. So if you're a better reader than a viewer, you've got that option for a lot of these archived calls too. Just want to remind everyone that our workplace flexibility readiness audit, for those of you that are I4CP members, again, this is available out at our website. Just go to i4cp.com. This is a very valuable new guide that we've just released, again, for I4CP members. And then just a little plug for our next Getting Hybrid Work Right series call. We'll have Anna White, this Chief Human Resources Officer from F5 Networks, one of our member companies. She'll be with us Thursday, May 26th to talk about all things hybrid work at F5. Same time as today, 11 a.m. Eastern and 8 a.m. Pacific. So with that, I want to thanks everyone. Great to hear from so many of you. Great to hear all of your comments in the chat as well. Great conversation, and look forward to being with you on a future Thursday. Have a good rest of your week, everyone. Thank you.